During the Cold War, Europe's air defense fighters were the first line of defense against possible Soviet aggression. NATO, in its early days, had one vital raison d'etre: to counter the forcible conversion of Western Europe to communism by the might of the USSR. The Cold War threat to Western Europe from the Soviet Union was massive and widespread. Any Warsaw Pact ground strike would have been preceded by a massive air assault. It was the task of the NATO fighters to see that this did not succeed. The Cold War was a truly exciting period in the development of interceptors. It saw a massive jump in their capability, not just in outright performance, but also in weapons, radar, and tactics. In the space of just 35 years, NATO's interceptors went from subsonic gun-armed jets like the Meteor to Mach 2 radar and missile-equipped fighters like the Mirage 3 to the latest generation of superfighters such as the F-16, the most numerous NATO fighter. And in the supreme irony, NATO air forces have begun to operate alongside their former foes. The collapse of the Soviet Union has brought about the end of the Cold War and a new period of cooperation in Europe. NATO is currently looking forward to welcoming into its alliance new air forces of the former Warsaw Pact. These fly the very MiG fighters that NATO was once asked to destroy. Throughout the Cold War, the task of defending the European alliance was not an easy one. The region's geography presented a wide variety of problems when it came to air defense. Germany was on the Iron Curtain front line. Major Soviet air bases were only a few minutes flying time from the country's industrial heartland, and the defense of Germany was a key pillar of NATO's strategy. Great Britain, on the other hand, was the linchpin of NATO's plans for reinforcement across the North Atlantic. The Royal Air Force formed the backbone of NATO air power throughout the 1950s and continued to contribute massive forces to the defense of Germany. RAF fighters were also charged with the very different task of defending the British Isles from attack by Soviet bombers far out over the Northern Oceans. France, although not a full member of NATO's military organization, played an important part. France was still a primary Soviet target, and this called for many of the same requirements as the defense of Germany. Other NATO members, particularly those on NATO's flanks bordering directly with the USSR, had problems peculiar to their own geographical locations. The remote wastes of northern Norway commanded the Arctic, while Turkey bottled up Soviet access to the Mediterranean Sea. Both were key targets and had to be defended. The Cold War was a period of high tension between two massive power blocks. Throughout this period, the pace of NATO's fighter development was matched and frequently surpassed by that of the Warsaw Pact. Soviet aircraft were generally underestimated by Western analysts, but this was often unfounded. During the Korean War, in the early 1950s, American superiority over the Soviet MiG-15 fighter was thanks largely due to better pilot training and tactics. In many respects, the MiG was superior to the American F-86 Sabre. And NATO's qualitative advantage was easily negated by the Warsaw Pact's overwhelming superiority in numbers. NATO was threatened by thousands of long-range bombers and tactical fighter bombers. Their missions range from close support of ground forces to long-range nuclear strike against targets as far away as Scotland and Spain. standardization of military equipment gave another advantage to the Warsaw Pact. Operating the same types of MiG and Sukhoi combat aircraft not only lowered cost, but also increased efficiency. In the event of mobilization for war, a squadron of fighters could have flown from Siberia to East Germany without notice and be met on arrival by trained ground crews who could refuel and rearm the aircraft for combat in minutes. In the aftermath of World War II, Western air forces largely flew piston-engined fighters, and when these nations came to replacing their late-model Spitfires and Tempests, Britain was well placed to take them into the jet age with two designs, the Meteor and the Vampire. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization came into being in April 1949, and fighter power was dominated initially by the Royal Air Force.
Operations.
Entering service in 1944, the Gloucester Meteor was the Royal Air Force's first operational jet fighter. After World War II, it went on to equip many air defense fighter squadrons in the British Isles and in Germany. Throughout the late 1940s, much of the air defense of Western Europe was entrusted to this straight-winged, twin-engined jet. The single-seat Interceptor was also joined by a two-seat night fighter version to provide all-weather defense. The Meteor also gave the first experience of jet fighters to the air forces of Belgium, Denmark, and the Netherlands. The twin-boom Vampire entered service with the RAF in 1946. In Europe, it was every bit as successful as its bigger British rival. The Vampire served initially as a fighter, but later became an excellent fighter bomber. But Britain's early lead in fighter design was soon overtaken by the USA and the USSR. Although both the Meteor and Vampire continued to serve well into the 1950s, they had been outclassed by swept-wing jets with near supersonic performance. The classic F-86 Sabre was one of the first swept-wing jet fighters to enter service. Tested in combat over Korea, where it overwhelmed the Soviet MiG-15, the Sabre became Europe's main air defense fighter in the 1950s. The North American members of the Atlantic Alliance contributed immensely to the defense of Europe throughout the Cold War. American-built Sabres first came to Europe with the US Air Force fighter wings, and these were soon joined by 12 squadrons of Sabres built under license in Canada. Other NATO users included Greece, Italy, Norway, Turkey, and Germany. The Sabre served as Portugal's first line of air defense well into the 1960s. Britain became a major operator pending delivery of its own delayed fighter designs. The most famous of these was the Hawker Hunter, which became the classic British Interceptor in the 1950s. One of the most elegant aircraft ever built, it was sold widely. NATO air forces wasted no time in choosing this excellent fighter, and it was soon in service with Belgium, Denmark, and the Netherlands. NATO fighters had to be able to intercept intruders by day and night. Two-seater night fighter versions of the Meteor and Vampire gave way to larger, more complex machines, such as the Canadian CF-100. Designed to protect the vast expanses of northern Canada, it was also deployed by the Canadian forces to Western Europe. Belgium was the only other NATO user buying the 54 Clunks in 1957. France's classic fighter of the 1950s was the Mystère 4A. This fast and agile single-seater formed the basis of the Super Mystère, which became Europe's first operational supersonic fighter. America dominated the early supersonic years with the F-100 Super Sabre, but the pace of fighter development was relentless. Even as the first supersonic jets were entering service, NATO nations were developing a fighter capable of Mach 2. In 1961, the Armée de l'Air had the distinction of becoming the first service in Western Europe with an operational Mach 2 fighter, the Mirage 3. This versatile fighter heralded a new generation of interceptors equipped with sophisticated fire control radar and armed not just with guns, but also with short and medium-range air-to-air missiles. The Mirage was widely exported and served into the 1990s. Although the Mirage 3 family would be France's most successful aviation export, these sales were mostly gained outside Europe. Instead, the USA dominated the scene with the Lockheed Starfighter. Nicknamed the missile with a man in it, this was arguably the first Eurofighter. During the 1960s, almost 2,000 were built for 9 NATO air forces: Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain, Turkey, and Germany. These versatile machines served not only as interceptors, but were also tasked with ground attack, nuclear strike, and reconnaissance. Belgium was a typical operator with 113 of these hot ships, most of which were built under license. Britain also entered the Mach 2 club in the early 1960s with the English Electric Lightning. The single-seater was used for the air defence of the British Isles, a difficult role to which it was arguably ill-suited. It was also only lightly armed and short-ranged. But the Lightning had performance in abundance. In its 3 decades of service, the Lightning's staggering climb rate and speed were not bettered until the arrival of the superfighters of the 1980s. Armament consisted of unguided rockets and just 2 infrared-guided Firestreak or Red Top air-to-air missiles. Top speed was over Mach 2, over Mach 2.2 for later versions. The Lightning's high single-seat workload meant that only the very best pilots were posted to fly it. Tasked solely with air defence of the UK, Lightnings were committed to RAF Germany from 1965. Wing Commander John Gilbert commanded No. 92 Squadron in Germany. He describes the unit's mission.
But when we took the aircraft to Germany, it was quite different. And it was different because we had to integrate into a much more complex air defence structure. And by the way, with 6 different nations' aircraft as well. And in addition to that, we had to deploy the aircraft forward. My squadron was based at Geilenkirchen on the Dutch border. But if we were to do our interception task, we had to go forward to Gütersloh. But of course, it enabled us to do our task properly, which was to get to the border extremely quickly in case there were any incursions. But the aircraft did the task very well. For our battle flight task, we had to intercept anything that came close to or strayed over the border. And for that purpose, we had an air defence interception zone, which was our side of the border. And we would aim to intercept anything that came into there that wasn't properly flight planned and checked through the radar system. But our rules of engagement were fairly strict, and we had to see any aircraft that we intercepted and identify it as not being a friendly aircraft. And then that aircraft had to commit what was termed a hostile act before we could shoot at it. And even then, we would need permission from the ground to do so. And we were not about to start World War III.
West Germany was not the only place to which Lightnings were deployed. The Royal Air Force also had a commitment to provide air defence for NATO's southern flank. Until the mid-1970s, Lightning squadrons frequently rotated through the RAF airbase at Akrotiri on Cyprus. Although Soviet air power in the Mediterranean was not as present as that over the North Sea, Lightning pilots never relaxed their vigil. Defence of the British Isles is a demanding mission, and from the mid-1970s, a new and more capable interceptor, the F-4 Phantom, began to supplant the Lightning. Originally developed as a carrier jet, the American Phantom is one of the greatest aircraft of all time. It was tested in combat with great success against Soviet-built fighters in Vietnam and in the Middle East. In Europe, the Phantom became the primary air defence weapon of Britain and West Germany. It was also widely used as an interceptor and reconnaissance aircraft by the US Air Force in Europe. This Phantom of No. 56 Squadron, the Firebirds, is seen on an actual mission to intercept an unknown Soviet intruder. Fully armed with 8 live Sidewinder and Sparrow missiles, the F-4 is being vectored to its trade by a Shackleton airborne early warning aircraft. In RAF service, the F-4 was tasked with a variety of air defence missions, from battlefield air superiority over Germany to long-range over-ocean interception from bases on the eastern coast of the British Isles. Although its performance was not quite as blistering as the Lightning, the Phantom did offer critical advantages as an interceptor in several key areas, notably with its 2-crew cockpit to share the high workload, efficient Spey turbofan engines for long-range endurance, and heavy missile load for better combat persistence. In this case, the intruder is a Badger C bomber. Large underwing pylons allow it to carry 2 massive anti-ship missiles. The Phantom shepherds the Soviet aircraft away from the British Isles before it enters UK airspace. By the mid-1970s, the Mirage 3 began to be superseded in the interceptor role by the Mirage F1. The Armée de l'Air bought 250 F1s, equipping a total of 9 air defense squadrons. Mirage F1s were also sold to Greece and Spain. Although Sweden has never been a member of NATO, it was long faced with the same kind of threat as its neighbours to the south. The inventive Swedish aviation industry was second to none when it came to developing advanced, innovative aircraft to protect the country's highly cherished neutrality. The Tunnan was also operated by neutral Austria. The two-seat Lansen served as an all-weather interceptor and ground attack aircraft. The unusual double-delta Draken was one of Europe's first Mach II fighters. It was also sold to Denmark, Finland, and Austria. The Draken was succeeded by the Viggen, whose canard-winged layout predated the current generation of fighters by more than 20 years. Sweden's fighters are regularly dispersed to stretches of highway to reduce the chances of being destroyed during surprise attacks. The Swedish Air Force bought 330 Viggens in separate versions for interception, attack, maritime strike, and reconnaissance. About half this total is made up of JA-37 interceptors, which have been Sweden's main fighter since 1978. The Viggen is armed with a powerful 30mm cannon and carries 6 air-to-air weapons. These are license-built Sidewinder and Skyflash missiles. Protecting NATO's central southern flank is the responsibility of the Italian Air Force. Italy is the last major European operator of the Starfighter and has built nearly 300 under license.
Papa, Charlie 2 positivo.
Quercia, Gruppo Alfa 1403.
4 e 03 da Quercia, forte e chiaro. Confermati, ispettore 360.
Confermiamo 360.
Developed specifically for Italy, the F-104S model was the last and ultimate expression of Lockheed's manned missile. It's the only Starfighter version capable of carrying the Sparrow medium-range missile. By the 1980s, the Starfighter's intercept capability in key areas was deficient. Rather than buying expensive newer superfighters, Italy chose to upgrade nearly 150 of her F-104s under the ASA, or Armament System Modernization Program. This adds improved radar and allows the Starfighter to fire the ASPEED medium-range missile. These greatly increase the F-104's ability to detect and shoot down targets at low level, as well as its air-to-ground capability. This is a practice intercept against an Alitalia Boeing 747 airliner. West Germany became the place in Europe for Phantoms during the Cold War. Aside from the Royal Air Force squadrons and US Air Force F-4 wings, the Luftwaffe was another large-scale operator of the big American two-seat fighter. Like the Italian Starfighter, the F-4F has also been upgraded for continued service into the 21st century. In the 1960s, the Luftwaffe bought 175 Phantoms for air defense and ground attack. These equipped 2 fighter and 2 fighter-bomber wings. Beginning in the late 1980s, the Phantom was upgraded under the Kampfversteigerung KWS program. This is designed to improve its abilities as a long-range interceptor rather than a dogfighter. A Luftwaffe pilot who flies the upgraded Phantom describes the improvements made.
You know, tactics change, and you cannot say, okay, this tactic works. It may be good for today, but you will lose tomorrow. It's always a kind of a fluid process. But yes, if I had MRAM ordnance on the jet, I would go against them really fast and try to launch those missiles on fairly long ranges. And I do not want to go into a close-in dogfight situation with the MiGs, because then I probably lose. So I want to fight against them as far out as I can, shoot the missiles, hopefully they will hit the target, and then I just turn around and go home. Go at the bar and have a drink.
Like Sweden, another neutral country which rigorously guards her airspace is Switzerland. Like the Swedish Air Force, the Swiss Air Force regularly practices dispersed operations from stretches of motorway. By this time, the Soviet threat had improved dramatically with the introduction of new advanced Soviet fighters. This called for a new generation of NATO fighters to deal with the threat. Best of the new breed, which appeared in the late 1970s, the F-15 Eagle replaced the classic Phantom in USAF service. Replacing the Royal Air Force as the major air power in Europe, the USAF has contributed extensively to the air defense of NATO. The West's premier air superiority fighter, Eagle interceptors, sat Zulu Interceptor Alert with 2 wings at Bitburg in Germany and Soesterberg in the Netherlands, as well as a squadron at Keflavik in Iceland. Smaller but just as agile as the F-15 is the F-16 Fighting Falcon, which has become the most successful fighter in Europe. Aside from a major USAF presence with F-16 wings, which have been based in Germany, Spain and Italy, the F-16 is operated by no less than 6 NATO air forces. Europe's last great fighter competition had been won by the Americans with the Starfighter. 20 years later, when it came to replace the Lockheed fighter in 1975, the F-16 was selected by 4 NATO members in what became known as the sale of the century. The massive deal involved the sale of 553 F-16As to Denmark, Norway, Belgium and the Netherlands, with most of the aircraft being produced under license by SABCA in Belgium and Fokker in Holland. Further sales of the latest C model F-16s have also taken place to Turkey and Greece. Illustrating their ability to carry out night intercepts are these Dutch Fighting Falcons. these Belgian F-16s are conducting a Sidewinder missile firing exercise. Comparable with the F-16, the Dassault Mirage 2000 is currently France's standard interceptor. Returning to Dassault's traditional delta wing, the Mirage 2000 entered service in 1985 as the Cold War was drawing to a close. Equipped with an advanced fly-by-wire control system, it's a match for the Russian MiG-29 Fulcrum. Throughout the 1980s, Canada maintained her air defense commitment to NATO with a wing of CF-18 Hornet multi-role fighters at Baden-Sollingen in West Germany. Spain, the most recent NATO member, bought 72 Hornets. These are dual-role with fighter and attack tasks. The majority of their missions, 60%, are air defense. The Hornet has also been bought by two neutral European air forces, Finland and Switzerland. Contrasting greatly with the highly agile fighters in use elsewhere, Britain's Tornado F-3 was designed to intercept Soviet bombers 1,000 kilometers out over the ocean. Although reasonably agile, it's no dogfighter. But its excellent radar and weapons fit, allied to a high economical cruise speed, make it superb in the task for which it was designed. Two squadrons of RAF Tornado F Mark IIIs have also been sold recently to the Italian Air Force to supplement the upgraded Starfighters until the arrival of the Eurofighter 2000. At the very leading edge of air power throughout the Cold War, NATO fighter pilots regularly kept up their skills at air combat maneuvering by practicing against similar and dissimilar fighters. These are two actual practice air combats between Belgian F-16s and French Air Force Mirage 2000s. Since the beginning of the Cold War, in the last half of the 1940s, NATO interceptors have guarded Western Europe against possible attack by Warsaw Pact forces. The fighters themselves became faster, more complex and better performing. The pace of development was breathtaking. The time span from the earliest straight-winged and gun-armed jets immediately after World War II to missile-armed Mach 2 fighters was just a dozen years. But throughout this period, the interceptor's task always remained the same. They had to remain alert 24 hours a day, ready to scramble at a moment's notice to intercept, identify, and if necessary, shoot down hostile intruders. It remains one of the mightiest fighting forces in the world, with over 5,000 combat aircraft alone. The Russian Air Force has a strike and defense capability that is virtually unmatched. From strategic bombers, tactical attack jets and interceptors to attack helicopters, it flies some of the most advanced combat types in the world. The Russian Air Force is one of the most powerful in the world. It operates new aircraft with capabilities second to none. A massive aerial might of the Red Air Force was seen by NATO to be poised on its eastern flank, ready to be unleashed as part of an all-out war. Had the Cold War ever turned hot, 5 Soviet armies would have smashed their way across the Central European front. They would have been supported by heli-borne assaults and organic army aviation forces. In the air, mass formations of bombers and fighters would have punched their way through NATO's defenses. In East Germany alone, the Soviet 16th Air Army had 20 regiments of the latest fast jet fighters, fighter bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. Although many questioned the quality of Soviet engineering, nobody could deny the sheer numbers of aircraft deployed. With the breakup of the USSR, Russia's defense establishment suffered drastic budget cutbacks. Even so, its air forces remain powerful, second only to those of the United States. That power is applied through a completely re-equipped air force, which now operates aircraft which are generally at least as good as, and in some cases much better than their Western equivalents. Russian combat aircraft are operated by 6 separate components. The Russian Air Force, the VVS, is in overall control of the bulk of aviation forces. It's split into 3 main combat commands. The main offensive arm is Long-Range Aviation, the DA. This force is responsible for strategic strike, operating Bear, Backfire, and Blackjack bombers. It's tasked with both long-range nuclear and conventional attack. The largest VVS component numerically is frontal aviation. This force flies tactical fast jets and is concerned with tactical nuclear strike, battlefield air superiority, air interdiction, and close support of Russian ground forces. Transport aviation, the VTA, controls the huge fleet of military transport aircraft. Many of these are operated in civilian colors. The VPVO, or Troops of the Air Defense, is responsible for air defense of Rodina, or Russian motherland. It's entirely separate from the VVS and is a huge command in its own right. It controls Russia's massive air defense system, including interceptors, surface-to-air missiles, and all radar and early warning systems. Russian naval aviation, known as AVMF, provides air support for naval operations. Its tasks include anti-ship strike, anti-submarine warfare, and naval assault. It operates maritime patrol aircraft, shipborne helicopters, and carrier fighters. Finally, Army aviation is an organic force, which is integrated into Russia's ground forces. It controls more than 3,000 assault, transport, general purpose, and gunship helicopters. All 6 Russian air arms fly some of the most advanced combat aircraft in the world. The Tu-160 is Russia's newest strategic bomber. It's the heaviest combat aircraft ever flown, weighing 275 tons fully loaded. The supersonic Blackjack is primarily a nuclear strike bomber. It's designed to penetrate enemy defenses at high or low level, making the last portion of an attack at supersonic speeds. Its warload of AS-15 and AS-16 nuclear cruise missiles is carried internally on 2 rotary launchers. The Blackjack can also deliver a heavy load of conventional weapons. Like the American B-1, the Blackjack has variable geometry or swing wings. These give it a top speed of 2,000 kilometers per hour and a range of around 14,000 kilometers. The Tu-160 first flew in 1981 and entered service in 1987. Very few Tu-160s are currently operational in Russia. The mighty Tupolev Bear is the equivalent of the US Air Force's B-52 Stratofortress bomber. Both share a similar performance and capability and have had remarkably long-lived careers. But whereas the B-52 is powered by 8 jet engines, the Bear only has 4, and they're turboprops. These enormous engines turn huge contra-rotating propellers. Combined with the swept wing, they drive the Bear to a top speed of 925 kilometers per hour, making it the world's fastest production propeller-driven aircraft. The latest operational bomber version is the Tu-95 MS Bear H. Its strategic Cold War mission was to attack targets from outside hostile airspace, armed with up to 16 Kh-55 cruise missiles. Similar to the American air-launched cruise weapon, the Kh-55 weighs 1,700 kilograms and has a range of over 3,500 kilometers. Around 65 Bear H's serve with the DA, and a further 20 also serve with Ukraine and Kazakhstan. With 100 examples in service, the Tu-22M Backfire forms the backbone of Russia's strategic bomber and long-range naval aviation forces. The swing-wing supersonic Backfire is an extremely potent bomber. The primary attack aircraft of Russian frontal aviation is the Sukhoi Su-24 Fencer. It's similar in performance and design to the Tornado IDS or the American F-111. Like its Western counterparts, the Su-24 is tasked with all-weather precision strike, both nuclear and conventional. To evade NATO's air defences, it had to penetrate hostile airspace at low level and at supersonic speeds. The Su-24 carries up to 8 tons of weapons. These include tactical nuclear bombs, conventional freefall bombs, rockets, and air-to-surface guided missiles. The Kh-59 missile is a medium-range TV-guided attack missile. The Su-24 entered service with Soviet air forces in the mid-1970s and has been used extensively in combat in Afghanistan and more recently in Chechnya. The Fencer remains in widespread frontline use. Russian frontal aviation has around 450 Su-24s. Other Russian strike aircraft include the MiG-27. This is a dedicated ground attack derivative of the MiG-23 Interceptor, whose specific Cold War missions included defense suppression, tactical nuclear strike, and close air support. Its 4-ton warload included a wide range of precision-guided missiles, as well as dumb bombs. Like the Su-24, the MiG-27 also saw combat in Afghanistan. Russia still has large numbers of MiG-27s, but these are being rapidly withdrawn from service to comply with conventional arms limitation treaties. Similar to the MiG-27, the Su-17 fitter served in large numbers until fairly recently. Like the MiG-27, the single-engined Su-17 is also being withdrawn from service. The Su-25 Frogfoot is a rugged and extremely hard-hitting ground attack aircraft. Like the American A-10, it was designed to provide very close fire support with up to 4 tons of weapons. The heavily armed Su-25 was also used extensively in Afghanistan. Frontal aviation's most capable fighter is the MiG-29 Fulcrum. This was the first of a new generation of Soviet superfighters, which was designed to match and even outperform highly agile Western fighters like the F-16. The MiG-29 is aerodynamically very advanced. It's also immensely strong. The MiG entered service with the Soviet Air Force in 1983 and began to replace older MiG-23 interceptors. By 1990, it had equipped at least 14 fighter regiments around the USSR. The MiG was numerically the most important fighter with the Soviet 16th Air Army in the Western group of forces, equipping 8 out of 9 fighter regiments in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. During the Cold War, MiG-29s were tasked primarily with air defense and gaining air superiority. From their East European bases, they could cover all of Germany, most of Belgium, Holland, and northern France. Standard air-to-air missile armament comprises 4 short-range R-73s and 2 medium-range R-27s, carried in both radar and infrared homing forms. Both weapons are considered superior, especially in maneuverability and range, to the latest versions of their Western equivalents, the AIM-9 Sidewinder and the AIM-7 Sparrow. Had war broken out, the MiG-29 would have used these weapons to destroy NATO fighters, fighter bombers, as well as high-value assets such as AWACS and tankers. The missile armament is backed by an internal 30mm cannon for close air combat and ground strafing. It's an extremely accurate weapon. An infrared search and track sensor is mounted in front of the MiG-29's cockpit. This allows targets to be detected passively. The IRST can pick up an aircraft-sized heat source at tens of kilometers without generating giveaway radar signals. Mounted in tandem with the IRST is a laser rangefinder. This provides highly accurate range information for the MiG's missiles and cannon. Although designed primarily for the fighter role, the MiG-29 has an important ground attack capability. It can carry 3 tons of free-fall and retarded bombs or air-to-ground rockets up to a caliber of 240 millimeters. In the tactical nuclear strike role, it carries a single RN-40 weapon with a 30 kiloton yield. A defecting MiG-29 pilot once stated that it was standard practice for his regiment to give specific tasks to each of the 3 squadrons, one for tactical nuclear strike, one for fighter escort, and one for air defense of the home base. With around 500 examples in service, the MiG-29 forms the backbone of the VVS tactical fighter force. Since the breakup of the USSR, it's become the mainstay of the air forces of many former Soviet republics, which account for a further 350 machines. During the 1970s and 1980s, the MiG-23 Flogger was the most important Soviet fighter. Its main weapon was the R-23 AA-7 Apex medium-range missile, similar to the American Sparrow. Although tasked with gaining battlefield air superiority, the Flogger also had an important secondary ground attack role. The Flogger serves in huge numbers with frontal aviation and with Soviet air defense forces. It was also widely exported to the USSR's allies in the Warsaw Pact and her client states around the world. It was used in combat in Afghanistan. Although it's now apparently obsolete, the MiG-23 remains a significant combat aircraft. Ever ready to protect Rodina or Mother Russia, the air defense forces of the former Soviet Union, the VPVO, are the most extensive in the world. It has nearly 2,500 operational interceptors. These are some of the most advanced and capable in the world. Numerically, the MiG-23 remains the most important interceptor with the VPVO, with over 1,000 in service. Typical of the command's long-range interceptors is the MiG-25P Foxbat, whose top speed is over Mach 3, and it's unmatched by any other combat aircraft in the world. The main air-to-air weapon is the medium-range R-40 missile, seen here carried by a development of the MiG-25, the MiG-31 Foxhound. With a top speed of 3,000 kilometers per hour at high altitude, Foxhound is an ultra-long-range interceptor which complements the Su-27 flanker. Russia's sheer size presents unique challenges to those tasked with the defense of her borders. Fighters designed to operate across the immense distances involved need good long-range performance, a high top speed for reaching the intercept area quickly, and effective beyond visual range weapons. At the heart of the MiG-31 is the Zaslon radar. This is the world's first operational phased array intercept radar, which can detect up to 10 fighter targets at 200 kilometers. It can track them at up to 125 kilometers and engage 4 simultaneously. Even more impressive, groups of 4 MiG-31s can operate together, exchanging target information by data link. They can cover a swathe of territory 900 kilometers across during a patrol. The Russian equivalent of Phoenix is the R-33 AA-9 Amos. This is a radar-guided weapon with a range of at least 100 kilometers. The Foxhound entered service with the PVO in 1982. About 330 are operational throughout Russia. The VPVO's most capable fighter, indeed arguably the best fighter in the world, is the Su-27 Flanker. It's a superb all-rounder, capable of outflying virtually any other fighter in close air combat, as well as being a formidable long-range interceptor. About 500 Flanker Bs serve with the VPVO and frontal aviation, primarily as air superiority or escort fighters. Air-to-ground missions are practiced by some units. 2 regiments, about 60 Su-27s, also serve with the Ukrainian Air Force. The huge size of the flanker allows it to carry over 9 tons of fuel internally. That's about the same as an F-15 with 2 external tanks. This gives an unrefueled range of over 3,500 kilometers. The flanker's excellent sensors, ability to carry 10 air-to-air missiles, long range, and agility make it an invaluable combat aircraft for both defensive and offensive purposes. To the VPVO, it could intercept NATO's strategic bombers and tactical strike aircraft long before they presented a threat to the Rodina. Offensively, frontal aviation flankers would have been a huge threat to NATO. Their long range would have allowed them to escort Soviet strike aircraft to attack practically any target in Western Europe. They could punch a corridor through defending NATO interceptors at long range and then engage and outfight them, if necessary, during air combat. The Su-27's advanced pulse Doppler radar has a detection range of 240 kilometers. It's backed by an electro-optical sensor consisting of an infrared search and track system and a laser rangefinder. These can be slaved to the pilot's helmet-mounted target designator. During air combat, the pilot can also cue missile seekers onto a target by simply moving his head. Flanker is the world's most heavily armed fighter. Its primary weapon is the R-27. Up to 6 can be carried in both radar and infrared homing forms. 4 R-73 highly agile medium-range missiles are carried for dogfighting. These are backed by a 30mm cannon, the same of that on the MiG-29, with 150 rounds. Advanced derivatives of the Flanker will form the basis of Russia's next-generation air force. The two-seat Su-34 is a long-range strike version, equivalent to the United States Air Force F-15E Strike Eagle. The 4 major fleets of the Russian Navy have their own powerful aviation forces. Although naval aviation is dominated by shore-based bombers and helicopters, there is also a small carrier-based force for projecting power at sea. Embarked on Russia's only operational carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov, are 10 Ka-27 and Ka-29 Helix helicopters for naval assault and ASW. Fixed-wing power is provided by the navalized versions of the Su-25 and Su-27. Sukhoi developed the Su-27Ku as a two-seat carrier trainer. The operational naval flanker was the single-seat Su-27K, which entered service as the Su-33. 16 are stationed on the Kuznetsov. They are purely used as interceptors. The Su-25 UTG is a two-seat version of the Frogfoot. 8 are deployed for use as trainers, although another version may be developed for naval strike. The 65,000-ton Kuznetsov was the first in a class of 4 Russian carriers. 3 were cancelled with the breakup of the USSR. Unlike large Western carriers, it does not have a catapult. Instead, aircraft are tethered, run up to full power, and launched from a ski jump. The Yak-38 shipboard fighter served aboard the Soviet Navy's 43,000-ton Kiev-class aircraft carriers. All have been scrapped or are in reserve. The Yak-38 was a multi-role machine carrying out both fighter and light attack missions. Like the British Harrier, it could take off and land vertically. Each carrier embarked 12 Forger fighters and 2 trainers. The Yak-38 was not as successful nor as versatile as the Harrier. Nearly 40 were lost in accidents. Large multi-engine aircraft like the Tupolev Bear, Badger and Aleutian May are used for maritime patrol, reconnaissance and anti-submarine warfare. Naval strike, anti-ship strike and reconnaissance is carried out by 350 backfire bombers, Fencers and Frogfoots. Maritime reconnaissance is a key AVMF mission, and Tu-22 blinders carried out this task until recently. Ukraine still uses blinders as long-range bombers. The strange Ekranoplan is a mixture of ship and aircraft which skims at very high speed a few meters above the surface of the sea. It could be used for very fast naval assault or for launching surface-to-surface anti-ship missiles. Army aviation's prime function is to support troops on the ground. Until 1979, It was an integrated part of frontal aviation, but then became a separate command. The primary assault transport helicopter remains the rugged and dependable Mi-8 HIP, of which there are an estimated 1,300 in service. It carries up to 30 troops. The most important and influential helicopter to enter service during the Cold War was the Mi-24 gunship. In the absence of a dedicated ground attack fighter, the Hind gave Russian army commanders their own organic close air support, acting as a flying tank or airborne artillery. The Hind allowed the Soviet army to develop new tactics, making best use of its high speed and firepower to achieve maximum surprise and shock value. Both the HIP and Hind saw extensive combat during the Soviet campaign in Afghanistan. 2 advanced helicopters have been developed to replace the 1,200 Hinds still in service. The Radical Ka-50 is a single-seat machine which not only is an effective tank killer but also appears to be a formidable fighter helicopter. Its competitor is the more conventional MIL Mi-28, which resembles the American Apache gunship. Army aviation can call upon the services of huge transport helicopters. The Mi-6 has a payload of 12 tons. Its successor, the Mi-26, is the world's largest and most powerful operational helicopter. Its cabin is the same size as a Hercules and can haul 20 tons or 80 troops. The Russian Air Forces operate some of the most diverse and capable combat aircraft in the world. Radical cutbacks since the end of the Cold War have made them slimmer but fitter. Their ability to project power on a massive scale is only matched by that of the United States. The claws of the Russian bear are still as sharp as ever.
For 15 years during the Cold War, Britain's status as a global power was embodied by her strategic nuclear bombers, the V-Force. On constant alert, ready to be airborne and on their way eastward in less than 4 minutes, aircrew trained for just one task: to deliver the ultimate weapon of destruction. The conflict between the two superpowers during the Cold War threatened the human race with extinction by massive nuclear exchange. During this period, a small but independent nuclear deterrence was also established by two European powers, the United Kingdom and France. Britain's strategic nuclear bombers, the V-Force, provided her nuclear deterrent until 1969. They sat alert 24 hours per day, 365 days a year, with aircraft ready to launch at a moment's notice. France, too, had a nuclear bomber, the supersonic Mirage 4. This carried out a mission known as Pre-Strategic Nuclear Strike. The Mirage 4 has only very recently relinquished this role in favor of a more modern successor, the Mirage 2000N. The detonation of the first atomic weapons in anger over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 brought about the end of World War II. The bombs stunned the world with their awesome power and heralded a new age in global relations. Only America possessed the A-bomb, but the Soviet Union was catching up quickly. British scientists had been fully involved in the Manhattan Project, the development of the American atomic weapon. But immediately after the war, President Truman, unaware of this fact, embargoed the passing of nuclear weapons technology to London. After World War II, Britain and France still possessed some measure of influence in global affairs through their far-flung colonies around the world. But this influence was waning and had been taken over by the United States and the Soviet Union, which was aggressively expanding its influence in the name of worldwide communist revolution. In order to secure a continued place at the world's top table, Britain, and later France, embarked on the development of an independent nuclear deterrent, along with bombers capable of delivering such weapons. In 1947, the RAF Chiefs of Staff declared their belief that the possession of weapons of mass destruction would be the most effective deterrent to war itself. Exhausted by war, its economy seriously weakened, and with social issues a national priority, Britain nevertheless embarked upon a massive atomic arms development program. This produced not one, but 3 jet bombers, known as the V bombers on account of their names, Valiant, Victor, and Vulcan. The Royal Air Force's post-war heavy bomber force relied on the Avro Lincoln, a refined and re-engined derivative of the Lancaster. The Lincoln was hardly suitable as a means for delivering atomic weapons. The V bomber requirement was demanding. It called for a 4-engine jet bomber with a range of 8,000 kilometers, capable of delivering a 4.5-ton atomic device while flying at 500 knots and 15,000 meters altitude. It had to be developed in just 2 years for service in 1953. In the meantime, RAF Bomber Command operated B-29 superfortresses on loan from the U.S. Air Force. Known as Washingtons, they were intended as a stopgap measure, but gave much useful experience in operating a relatively modern aircraft. Only at this stage did a clear target emerge. By 1947, Stalin's plans for worldwide communist expansion had turned British attention east towards the Soviet Union. The V-bomber requirement posed huge technical risks. As an insurance, an interim requirement was issued calling for a bomber with reduced speed and ceiling. Short's Sperrin was the winner. Only 2 prototypes were built, and they gave valuable service as test aircraft in support of the V-bomber program. For the more demanding specification, the RAF received 6 proposals, which were eventually reduced to 3. The first of these was the Valiant, which pioneered many of the weapons and tactics for the V-bomber. The prototype first flew in May 1951. After further testing and development, production Valiant bombers were released for service into the Royal Air Force in 1955. The age of the V-bomber had dawned. Possession of both bomb and aeroplane did not necessarily equal a nuclear capability. The early Valiants, flown by picked crews, spent much of their time training and practicing operating procedures. In April 1952, Britain exploded her first nuclear device aboard a redundant warship off Western Australia. This formed the core of Blue Danube, the first airdropped atomic bomb. Dummy bomb shapes had been dropped by Sperrins, but the actual weapon was not tested until October 1956, when a Valiant of No. 49 Squadron released a Blue Danube over Maralinga in southern Australia. attention immediately turned to the greater power of the hydrogen bomb, for which a development program had already been instituted. In May 1957, it was again a Valiant of No. 49 Squadron which dropped an H-bomb on Christmas Island in the Pacific. The release simultaneously proved the effectiveness of the high-altitude turn maneuver specially devised to ensure that the aircraft was 10 miles away at the moment of detonation. Britain now possessed an operational strategic nuclear strike aircraft able to hit targets 2,500 kilometers away. In all, the RAF received 104 production Valiants, the last being delivered in September 1957. These served as dual-role or triple-role bombers, tankers, and reconnaissance aircraft. Tanker capability was a most useful way of extending the V-bomber's range, and it was again the Valiant which undertook the lion's share of development work. One more first was claimed by the Valiant. 4 squadrons deployed to Malta in October 1956 to support Musketeer, the Anglo-French operation in Suez. The Valiant played a relatively minor role, dropping conventional bombs from medium altitude on Egyptian airfields. For its bomber design, Avro proposed a delta wing, a type of layout which had hitherto not been used on such a large aircraft anywhere in the world. Before committing to development of the bomber, Avro built 5 1/3 scale research aircraft for low and high speed testing of the delta wing configuration. In spite of the loss of the first aircraft, they validated the delta wing concept and provided much useful information for the Vulcan project. The Vulcan was the first of the new bombers to fly. The aircraft made an impressive sight as the Type 698 prototype was rolled out for its maiden flight in August of 1952. Its massive, almost perfect delta wing gave it the ability to cruise comfortably at high altitudes. It was as fast as a contemporary fighter, while at the same time, pilots praised its docile handling qualities. Displays at the Farnborough Air Show that year quickly followed, which demonstrated the Vulcan's fighter-like handling. In spite of its size, it could even be rolled easily. Flown with a stick, production Vulcans easily outmaneuvered fighters practicing intercepts against them at high altitudes. Completing the trio of V-bombers, the Victor became the last to fly on Christmas Eve, 1952. Like Avro, Handley Page also adopted an advanced wing design to meet the challenge of cruising at high subsonic speeds and at high altitudes. The most notable characteristic of the Victor was its crescent-shaped wing and high-set T-tail. Like the Avro 707, a similar research aircraft, the HP-88 was built to test this type of wing layout. This feature, a reducing wing sweep angle, ensures a constant Mach number along the entire length of the wing and generates very little transonic drag. With a top speed of 960 kilometers an hour at high altitude, the Victor was the fastest of all the V bombers. Indeed, a clean Victor could break the speed of sound in a shallow dive. The Victor also handled well, although it lacked the Vulcan's fighter-like agility. More importantly, the Victor could fly higher, faster, and farther, and could carry a larger conventional bomb load. The Vulcan and Victor had their own strengths and weaknesses, yet they were so closely matched in performance that the RAF decided in June of 1952 to order 25 of each for squadron-level assessment. But in that event, the RAF could never bring itself to choose between the pair, and they continued to be ordered in parallel until late in their production careers. The production Vulcan B Mark I was flown in 1955, followed the next year by the Victor. The Vulcan B Mark I introduced more powerful Olympus turbojets, as well as a new kinked delta wing, which gave better handling and safety at high speeds. Deliveries began to number 230 Operational Conversion Unit at Waddington in August of 1956. The following July, number 83 Squadron formed as the first operational unit. Victors were delivered to the OCU at Gaydon in late 1957. Number 10 Squadron at Cottesmore became operational in April of 1958. Due to its strategic nuclear role, the V-Force was an elite one. Getting into a V-bomber was no easy task. The crews were the best and most experienced in the RAF. All captains had to have 1,750 flying hours in command. The Vulcan force was rapidly established so that by the end of 1958, there were squadrons at Waddington, Finningley, and Scampton. By September of 1960, deployment in the Victor Mark I was complete, with 2 squadrons each at Cottesmore and Huntington. Unlike SAC bombers, which had some measure of defensive armament, the V bombers flew entirely unarmed. The strategy changed from 1960 on, when all aircraft began to be modified with a comprehensive suite of electronic countermeasures, warning and jamming equipment. By mid-1958, the UK deterrent had reached a credible level with the issuing of the first hydrogen bomb, Yellow Sun. Credibility hinged in no small measure on the ability of the V-bombers to evade not only the Soviet air defense arm, but also a preemptive strike on their bases. At the hub of the deterrent force was a group of 10 Class A airfields, which acted as the main bases for the V-bomber squadrons. Each was protected by Bloodhound surface-to-air missiles. In addition, at least 26 further UK airfields were designated as dispersal bases, ranging from fighter command stations to civil airports. More bombers could have operated from Britain's Mediterranean bases and in the Near East, further complicating the task of the defense. The main bases were spread throughout the Midlands and East Anglia. The V-bombers were assigned to numbers 1 and 3 groups of Bomber Command, with number 3 group of Valiants and Victors occupying the southern area.
7 spots, 80, 90, 100, 110, 120, check speed is okay, 130, 135.
During this period, V-Force bombers frequently practiced long-range deployments to overseas locations. Usually conducted singly, these were known as Lone Ranger. They went eastward to West Germany, Cyprus, Saudi Arabia, and southward to Kenya and Rhodesia. Western Rangers headed across the Atlantic, stopping at Goose Bay in Canada before continuing to SAC headquarters at Offutt in Nebraska. Vulcans also participated in SAC's annual bombing contest. A close relationship in joint nuclear targeting developed between the V-Force and SAC, which incorporated the RAF bombers into its nuclear strike plan in 1958. Across the Channel, France had already begun to establish her own independent nuclear deterrent. Just 2 years after the first Valiance entered service, plans were underway for a bomber to equip her Force de Frappe, whose operations would closely match those of the V-Force. The requirement was just as challenging, as unlike Britain's V-Force, France's airborne nuclear delivery system would be supersonic. Dassault was chosen to build the aircraft, to be known as the Mirage 4. When the first of 4 prototypes was rolled out, it was seen that the design was essentially a scaled-up version of the single-seat Mirage 3 Delta Wing fighter, albeit some 50% larger and with twice the wing area, thrust, and weight. The Mirage 4 first took to the air in June 1959. In spite of its size, performance was astounding. A top speed of Mach 2.2 at altitude closely matched that of the fighter. The Mirage 4 became operational with the Force de Frappe in 1964. Now all 3 of the wartime Allied big powers possessed the ultimate weapon of destruction. In Britain, the new decade of the 1960s brought improved versions of V-bomber. The stopgap Valiant was not considered for further improvement, but both Vulcan and Victor were extensively modified. The Vulcan B Mark II introduced a new large span wing, together with uprated Olympus jets and a comprehensive ECM equipment fit. The new wing, with a dramatic double-kinked leading edge, greatly improved high-altitude performance, as well as extending range by 50%. The Victor B Mark II introduced Conway turbofans with twice the power of the B-1 Sapphire turbojets. Coupled with a slightly longer wingspan, these also improved high-altitude performance and range. The reaction time of the V-Force was constantly honed and improved. From 1962, the RAF practice of dispersing its V-Force changed to QRA, Quick Reaction Alert. Once alerted, flights of 4 V-bombers would disperse to the secondary airfields where special hard standings, complete with electrical supplies and minimal crew comforts, had been constructed by the runway's edge. Each squadron was tasked with having 1 aircraft at 15 minutes readiness throughout the year. But this was not enough against a surprise nuclear attack. The QRA system allowed each squadron to maintain 4 aircraft at 4 and later 2 minutes readiness. On receiving the order to scramble, crews aimed to be airborne in less than 4 minutes. Upon reaching the aircraft, the first priority was to get the engine started. The SimStart system, introduced on Mark II Vulcans, brought all 4 engines to life simultaneously and greatly reduced response times. Within just 35 seconds of engine start, Vulcans could begin to taxi whilst the Bloodhound SAMs protecting the main bases prepared to take on any incoming raids. From a standing start, the Vulcan could reach an altitude of 1,500 meters in just 1 minute. And climb to over 12,000 meters in just 10 minutes. Each crew knew its destination as soon as it joined the squadron. Since 1958, Bomber Command and SAC had adopted an integrated bombing plan. The grand strategy was beyond the knowledge of those at squadron level, but it certainly appeared that the RAF's role in an all-out nuclear exchange was to clear a way into the heart of the USSR for SAC bombers. After takeoff, the crew flew with flash curtains fully zipped up. The entire pre-planned route was flown by radar and instruments alone. The widespread introduction of the Mark II Victors and Vulcans released the Valiant for other duties. Among the most important was in-flight refueling. Valiants became full-time tankers in April 1962, and their main customers were fighters and attack aircraft. With regard to the rest of the V-Force, the tanker Valiants were there to permit global deployment at short notice. By the end of 1962, the V-Force was at its zenith, having achieved its intended maximum strength of 144 bombers. Victors were in service with 6 squadrons at Cottesmore, Marham, and Wittering. There were 9 Vulcan squadrons operated by 3 wings at Scrampton, Waddington, and Coningsby. A profound change in operating procedures was now being developed as the Soviet air defenses increased in effectiveness. The shooting down of an American U-2 high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft over Sverdlovsk in 1960 has been regarded as signaling the end of the V-bomber's effectiveness. But that was not the case. The U-2 had flown to the heart of the USSR without the benefit of offensive jamming and without 100 or so companions to help confuse the enemy. Bomber Command remained happy that it could still mount an effective mission at high level, but nevertheless made preparations to meet the prospect of more effective Soviet defense. Low-level operations offered the best chance of undetected penetration. Ground hugging was to give a new lease of operational life to the V-Force. But from a fatigue point of view, low-altitude flying imposed greater stress on the airframe. Devoid of any self-defense equipment apart from chaff, the Valiant Force was the first to be retasked for low-level tactical operations. Training proceeded normally until late 1964, when the entire Valiant fleet was found to have chronic wing fatigue. All were quickly withdrawn from service. Vulcans and Victors began low-level training in 1963. Changes in weaponry were also needed to keep the deterrent effective, so that during the 1960s, 3 methods of delivery were employed. Mark I versions of the Vulcan and Victor had progressed to an improved version of the Yellow Sun freefall bomb, which required them to make a pop-up maneuver to release the weapon from medium altitude over the target. B-2 Vulcans at Coningsby and Victors at Cottesmore were issued with the new British-designed freefall bomb, the WE-177. This was a laydown weapon intended for low-level release. Completing the trio was the Avro Blue Steel, a rocket-powered short-range nuclear missile with its own navigation system. Powered by highly volatile fuel, Blue Steel proved to be notoriously difficult to integrate onto both Vulcan and Victor. Modifications had to be made to the bomb bays and avionics to accommodate the weapon. But at long last, there was no need for the bomber to approach heavily defended areas. Blue Steel could be released from 185 kilometers away. It climbed to 21,000 meters before diving onto its target at Mach 1.8 and detonating a 1 megaton warhead. The weapon had to have a folding tail fin to fit the reduced ground clearance of the Victor's low undercarriage, and fueling it proved to be one of the most potentially hazardous occupations in the RAF. Avro built 57 production Blue Steel missiles, which were shared among 5 V-bomber units. The weapon became operational in late 1962, equipping 2 Victor squadrons, numbers 100 and 139, at Wittering, as well as 3 squadrons of the Vulcan wing at Scampton. These were numbers 27, 83, and 617, the famed Dam Busters. From mid-1964, Blue Steel was modified for low-level launch to match the new operational profile, although this imposed a severe penalty by cutting range to a quarter of that at high level. An improved version of Blue Steel was canceled in favor of an American weapon. The Douglas Skybolt was an air-launched ballistic missile with a range of 1,600 kilometers. Unfortunately for the RAF, the U.S. government canceled the Skybolt program in late 1962. Britain was subsequently forced to buy Polaris submarine-launched missiles to maintain its independent deterrent. At a stroke, the raison d'etre of the V-Force was removed. However, until Polaris entered service, the 144 V-Force bombers continued to form Britain's sole strategic nuclear deterrent, and they practiced this role throughout the 1960s. Coincident with the switch to low-level operations came a coat of gray and green camouflage. Lone Ranger overseas deployments continued, as well as conventional power projection missions, as occurred during the British confrontation with Indonesia. With a 16-ton conventional bomb load, the Victor was particularly well suited for this role. Victors and Vulcans were dispatched to the Far East as a reminder of British air power. Indonesia backed down. In 1966, the launch of the first of Britain's 4 Polaris-carrying submarines heralded the rundown of the V-Force. Operational patrols were conducted 2 years later. On 30th of June 1969, the Royal Navy resumed its historic role as Britain's first line of strategic defense. At midnight, the RAF's Vulcans ended QRA. The era of the V-bombers as Britain's nuclear guardians had ended. Victor and Vulcan squadrons disbanded or were converted to other duties, such as in-flight refueling or strategic reconnaissance. Since the retirement of the Valiant, Victors became the RAF's sole tanker assets. They carried out this important role for 30 years. One squadron of Vulcans was retasked with long-range maritime radar reconnaissance. Vulcans expanded their conventional bombing role, but also continued to carry WE-177. Based in Britain and Cyprus, they had two main roles: NATO theater nuclear strike in support of British national interests. A tactical form of WE-177 is now carried by the Vulcan successor, the Panavia Tornado interdictor strike aircraft. Unlike the V-bombers, the development of other strategic nuclear delivery systems did not affect the Mirage 4 as drastically. By 1976, France had completed her nuclear triad with the deployment of both submarine and land-launched ballistic missiles. But Mirage 4 still formed an integral component of the Force de Dissuasion, carrying the 65-kiloton AN-22 laydown weapon. The standoff weapon finally arrived in 1980 when 18 Mirage 4s were converted to IBP standard to carry the ASMP missile. They also acquired a new Antelope 5 ground mapping radar and modern navigational attack system. The IBP-ASMP combination entered service in 1985. Over 30 years of Mirage 4 operations came to an end in 1996. It had been augmented and then fully replaced in the nuclear strike role by its successor, the Mirage 2000N. Based on the combat trainer variant of the Mirage 2000 fighter, this two-seat aircraft will take France's strategic nuclear forces into the 21st century. The Paloma computerized mission planning system is a far cry from the firmly low-tech method of mission planning employed by the forebears of this aircrew. Digitized maps allow the crew to plan a route taking into account the latest threat reports. This information is then fed directly into the aircraft's onboard navigation and attack system. Like the Mirage 4, the 2000N has a crew of two, pilot in front and weapon system officer in the rear seat. ASMP, Air Sol Moyenne Portée, delivers a 300-kiloton warhead at a top speed of Mach 2. It has a range of 250 kilometers when launched from high altitude, or 80 kilometers at low altitude. The end of the Cold War has brought about a relaxation in the defense posture of both independent nuclear deterrents. In Britain, RAF Tornadoes remain wired to carry an upgraded form of the WE-177 weapon. The Armée de l'Air has two 2000N versions in service. NK-1, tasked solely with nuclear strike, and NK-2, tasked with conventional strike, but able to carry ASMP. Although this change means that British and French nuclear strike aircraft are no longer placed on high alert, they remain ready to attack at a very short notice with the ultimate weapons of destruction. Throughout the Cold War, Britain and France's independent nuclear deterrence symbolized their status as global powers. In view of the mightiness of the U.S. Strategic Air Command, it is unlikely that these greatly troubled Moscow. Yet the prospect of over 140 V bombers and a smaller number of Mirage 4s attacking every major city in the Western Soviet Union undoubtedly counted as a third and important factor in the power equation. The majesty of these graceful bombers will never be eclipsed.